So welcome back. This is the second chunk of the NAL ED assessment webinar. I will kick us off, just bringing us back to where we were. We have covered some assessment basics as well as some information on creating your own native language proficiency scale. And so now we're going to move into our final chunk regarding creating language assessments.
So we're going to start by talking about what language assessment should be. And first of all, it should be thoroughly understood by the teacher. That means you need to understand what you're doing. Too often, especially outside of Indigenous native language assessments, teachers are handed assessments and don't understand them. So this grant is a great opportunity for you to create assessments you believe in and understand. Assessment should also be integrated with instruction. Integrated with what you're teaching and not separate from what you're teaching. I think of assessment as a part of the discussion and as a contract between students and teachers of respect and beliefs about what is being learned. And we should also show that we understand the language development process. You know, you can't learn a new language in 3 weeks. And so that a language assessment should show this gradual learning process, as Ku was talking about, with different amounts of words, and as children or adults learn more and more language. And of course, most importantly, they need to align with Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, as Ku has been mentioning. So some additional key concepts in assessment are formative and summative assessment. So these are two things to think about when you're using an assessment for these different purposes. So formative assessments tend to be very quick and informal. They provide information on learning progress, and they provide feedback for the next step, which by contrast, summative tends to be a longer and more formal assessment, and it provides information on learning progress to a certain point, such as the end of a unit or a term or a semester, and just think about which purpose is most salient for you and what information you need. And so one thing to think about is how these kinds of assessments can work together to improve teaching and learning. And I like to think of these kinds of assessments as tools. So with when it's conducted, what information it provides, and how the results can be used. So formative assessment tends to happen during a course of instruction, and it tends to provide feedback about progress toward educational outcomes, and it can be used for planning and instruction. So you might, at the end of a formative assessment, think, my goodness, they really didn't learn this, we need to go back and repeat it, or at the end think, gosh, we need to move faster, they're getting this super fast. Whereas summative assessment tends to be at the end of a course of instruction to look at the extent to which you've achieved your outcomes. And it can be used to assign grades, to evaluate a program, or just to track progress within a program. And Ku was going, I'm going to send it back over to Ku to talk about the types of assessment.
So technically, assessments can be administered by various audiences. So there's the idea of a self-assessment, where it's really the learner who says, these are the words that I know, these are the songs and proverbs, etc., that I know. And then engaging with somebody that is a proficient native language speaker to see if they can actually communicate about an everyday topic, or they can present a slide presentation, a multimedia presentation on a specific language topic to an authentic audience, or tell a story to a child, etc., and essentially determine their own proficiency level. The most common form of assessment actually is teacher assessment, where it's the teacher who creates the vocabulary test. And again, the teacher determines what words are being tested and how they are tested. So it could be a written test, a multiple choice test, a fill in the blank test, or the one that we obviously prefer the most is an oral test, especially when your classes are small enough to do so. If you're teaching a class with 30 kids, then it's going to be very hard to do oral assessments. But basically, it's the teacher then that tests the students and gives them the grade basically based on their proficiency. And this proficiency is determined by the teacher. And then in our case, we've also created a professional assessment. So when somebody wants to get a Hawaiian language certificate, they can come to our organization, and then we will provide them with the various tests, which are primarily oral tests, and determine their proficiency level and give them a digital badge, basically, that verifies whether they are a 3, a 4, or 5. We don't certify below a 3, so that the first one that you have to reach is at least a 3 and a 4. And as far as a native speaker is concerned, that's just we don't give a test to them. We just talk story. We don't worry about vocabulary, things like that. If we have a short conversation with a native speaker, we'll figure that out immediately that that person is a native speaker, just by the way that they speak. And then then we just say, if you need an external validation because you're too shy to admit that you are a native speaker, and our native speakers often tend to be shy about it, those that come from that little island that I talked about, then we provide that external piece there.
Great. So one thing we want to think about is listening versus speaking, or listening and speaking. And one of the things that came up earlier was talking about students obeying commands. So that incorporates both listening and speaking. Do they understand what's being asked of them? And then how do they show that in their response? So when you're thinking about oral assessment, you need to think about both listening and speaking in terms of what you want to assess, and how students can show what they can do and understand. Sometimes students can understand more than they can do. So they might understand what you ask them, but they can't respond. So that's where things like oral commands, they can show their listening ability, but maybe they can't quite respond appropriately yet. And one of the most important things that I think Ku has talked about is, what are your expectations for the different levels? What are your expectations for listening and speaking, and how do they work together? So here are some approaches to oral proficiency assessment, and no one way is best. It's best to do what's going to be most reliable, valid, and practical for you. So I'm going to talk about a few ways to assess oral proficiency, and then what's included in that. So for example, we talked about a teacher, and Ku just mentioned conducting an interview or present some students with tasks to complete orally. So in this case, the teacher is the other participant and would rate the student's performance. And sometimes that can be really difficult if you have a lot of students and not a lot of time. And so sometimes teachers put students in pairs and have them complete a task together. For example, each student can have a part of the task to complete, like one can be the buyer and one can be the seller. And then as they get more advanced in language, you can give each student information that the other doesn't have. Like one person wants the shirt in blue instead of green, and that creates more of a negotiation of meaning. And so that's where pair-based oral proficiency assessment can be good, and the teacher can walk around and listen to all the pairs. There are also, and you can also do this, of course, in groups of larger students where you assign different roles to different students. So you can also think about, there are some computer programs that can elicit language from students so that you can rate it later, so that you could have all the students complete a task at once and you can listen to it during a planning period and use your rubric then. So you should think about the kinds of tasks that students need to complete, like purchasing something or an interaction where they ask for something, and how would you rate the student? And you need to think about, are these tasks authentic interactions? I liked when Ku was talking about introducing yourself, and maybe sometimes in your language you never have to introduce yourself because everyone knows each other. And so you need to think about ways that you can reasonably expect your students to perform in the language, and how you can set that up as a teacher. Can you set that up in pairs? Can you set it up in small groups? Does it have to be one-on-one? What kinds of things are different? And what do you need for each situation? And you need to make sure that everyone has a chance to show what they can do and that it's an authentic interaction. And think about how a computer can help you get that information about your students. When I think about a good assessment task, and this is based on some of John Norris's work. I'm just going to talk through this a little bit, which is if you decide that you want to design your own assessment tasks, you can help yourself by thinking about the following characteristics. So think first about your students' needs. And this goes back to what we were talking about, differences between older children and younger children. You know, what do they need? And what's authentic, both linguistically and developmentally for those students? How can you set up a task to make it authentic? As we talked about earlier, asking a 10-year-old about driving a car, or my personal favorite, when I was taking Spanish, we learned how to reserve a hotel room. I never had to reserve a hotel room when I was a teenager. It was not information that I kept in my brain. So that wasn't authentic. And a lot of Western language textbooks focus on things that maybe span different grade levels. So you need to be careful about that. And tasks should also be contextualized. With whom are you speaking? Is it an elder, a peer, or a younger person? So if you're thinking about teacher versus peer versus group assessment, do you give people different roles? Do you, just to make sure that you're contextualizing everything. And you also want to think about the context. Is it a formal context or an informal context? And all this will affect the language being used. And you should also think about the level, the proficiency level of the students being assessed. Are the tasks right for that level? Do they align with what you're expecting? And then you should always design your tasks with the rubric in mind to make sure that you're able to rate it. So I don't know how many of you have heard of backward design, and that's the idea that you begin where you want to go and then you plan accordingly with milestones along the way. So first you start by thinking, what can students do or know by the end of the year, or whatever unit you're looking at? And then the next thing to think about is, how can they show what they can do? Sometimes they show what they can do through listening comprehension or speaking, or a combination of both. And then you want to think about what units, what curriculums you need to plan to get them to this end of year or end of sequence. And then the next chunk, you go down from the big end of the year to slightly smaller. What can they do or know by the end of the unit, and how will they show that they can do it? And then you need to think, what lessons can I plan to get them there? So you start with a year divided into units, then units divided into lessons. Then you get into lesson planning, which is, what can students do or know by the end of a lesson, and how will they show that they can do it? And this is aligned to formative and summative assessment, because you can look at how can you assess at the end of a lesson if they've learned it. And then you need to think about within a lesson, what tasks will I plan to get them there? And this backward design process is iterative, which means you do it over again, and the different steps feed into each other at every level of planning. So as we wrap up, I have some tips and strategies, and they're all questions because everybody's situation is different. So you need to think about what is accessible. What are the pieces or chunks of spoken language that you can assess? And then you need to make sure you have enough time to do it. And as teachers, we always try to do multiple things at a time. And you just need to focus on the things that are accessible. For example, asking them to complete one task at a time, not multiple ones, and to finish one interaction before you go to the next one. So always focus on what a student knows and can do, not what they think they can do, or even necessarily exactly what you taught, but what they can do with it. And I think as teachers, we often overplan so that we have enough time, which is great for teaching, but with assessment, you can't just stop. You have to make sure that you have enough time to complete the assessment. And I like to tell people to take their assessment themselves and figure it will take students at least 1.5 times as long as it takes you, the teacher. And we want to make sure that you have enough time to rate the test and get it back to students. Make sure that you've planned enough time and that you're not overburdening yourself. And to think about what's important to you and how you've sequenced it and how you've prioritized it in your lesson. This next slide shows a little assessment and development checklist. And this is something that I like to look at before I give an assessment to students. And it's kind of quick and broad, just 7 things. But you can think about them, is it appropriate for my student population, for them linguistically, developmentally, in terms of their age, in terms of the context they're learning it in. And then think about validity. Is the intended purpose matching the purpose for testing? Then you want to think about input. is, can the students understand the assessment? Can they understand the directions and so on? And then getting back to practicality, do you have the resources you need to administer the assessment? And then do you have the resources needed to score the assessment? Do you have raters and so on? And then to analyze the results, how much time do you have to rate everything? And you need to check that the results will be used as intended by you if you're the developer, or if you're adapting another test, is it aligned to what was intended? And then to understand how to share the results with stakeholders so that when you do get the results, you can share it with students and it can help them improve. And as Ku pointed out, be encouraged so that they can get to that 3 level with their with the language that they have. And Ku, I'm going to throw this back over to you.
I would like to add in this context as well, that it's so important that we make sure that we test what the students actually know rather than trying to focus on the things that they don't know. You know, there's so many times that the tests are almost set up to where we're trying to figure out what the students don't know, but really focusing when it comes to this type of assessment that we give them an opportunity to showcase the things that they do know and make them feel good as part of their assessment as well, and not having them look at assessment as a punishment almost kind of thing. So for us as Native people, you know, our long-term goal really is to increase the use of the language among Native families, communities, and tribes, you know, and that to us means that our youth show an interest in the native language, that they start conversations in the language, and that they choose the language as their preferred medium of communication. Most of us still have a ways to go in this effort, but if we make this our measuring stick for a long-term goal, I think we're on the right track. And so when we look at traditional assessments and native language assessments today, I think that it's the same thing. We need to personalize these assessments because no child learns the same way and is at the same place developmentally, age-wise, etc., as the next child. We want to make sure, as Meg mentioned already, that the assessments are as much authentic as possible, which means performance-based. So where they actually are able, as I said, to exhibit their knowledge rather than just you know, showing what the teacher thinks they should know. At the same time, we want to make sure that our assessments are rigorous because our ancestors set extremely high standards for us, and we want to make sure that those standards are reached by our students. We have a Hawaiian proverb that says, "Kulia ikanu'u," strive you to reach your highest level, and that applies to learning, and it also applies to assessment. So we really want to give students the opportunity to show in what areas that they exceed, and if there's an area that they're especially strong in, that is measured and that is validated. Now, native language assessments can be informal or formal. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And so the idea there is, you know, that you can have just a group of people sitting around and talking, you know, in a group in terms of finding out where those students are as far as being comfortable in using the language. And so we can also have them create products and become teachers actually of information about their language, so that while this is used by us as an assessment of their capacity, it also becomes a teaching tool for others. So for example, one thing that we do is we have our students create a lot of multimedia products, and those are shared with younger age groups or other schools and things like that, and they get assessed on that product but that product is also used to make an impact. Finally, you know, it is so important for us that as we revive and normalize our languages, that we feel very confident that we have the right to develop our own scales that work for us and that assure that our language is perpetuated not just in school, but also at home and at play, and that we revitalize our languages according to the ways that we like to learn. So if we prefer to learn orally, then we should also be tested orally. Um, Furthermore, we want to make sure that we measure our own language proficiencies based on our standards and our parameters, and validate and reward native language proficiency based on our contexts and our needs.
So,
Uh,
oh,
yeah, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead. So some next steps for you. This has been a lot, and thanks for bearing with us. I love how Ku and I worked together looking at native language assessments and some more Western approaches. But I think it's really important for you to first define the functions and tasks that learners should be able to do within your context and culture. And then to create the language proficiency scale. And as I said, it takes time to create these scales. And as Ku and I discussed, you create it and you review it and you try it out and you just keep refining it until it works for you. And I also like to tell people to, you don't necessarily have to think of it as just creating. You can start with the Hawaiian scale and adapt it. You know, do what works for your language. And then you develop the assessment to go with it. And then you try it out. It should always be reviewed for bias and sensitivity. To make sure that it's not fair or unfair for one group or another, and to always reflect on what's working, what works for this, this particular population with this language. And when you watch what happens when you administer an assessment, you can really improve it to figure out what happened. And you need to communicate with your students, with participants, with the community to figure out how it can be improved and how the results can be used better. And I would say integrate the improvements regularly over time. One of the things a lot of people do is they fix things that aren't broken. They say, oh, this worked. And so they fix the whole test and they don't look at what was just fine and to leave it alone. And then to think about ways to report results. Report results is a fancy way of telling students how they did and how much progress they're making, and to share that information with parents and other people as well. And as we discussed, it's really important to think about how each step is important to creating a full assessment that is reliable and valid. And we need to make sure that it's practical and that you can do it in the time you have with the resources you have. Sarah?
Great, thanks. Can y'all hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing those final thoughts on assessment. In the email that you received this bit of recording in, you should have also received a link to a survey just asking for some feedback on the assessment webinar and on things that will be coming up in the future. We appreciate you taking the time to view the last chunk of the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out with those and I can get you in touch with either of the presenters to be able to get clarification on anything that you might have been learning about in this last bit. And we really appreciate Meg and Ku joining us today and sharing their expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.